The Bible says do not resist authority, but it also says to protect the weak. So do we celebrate rebellion every July 4th? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Roger Booton.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
So the heart of the gospel is about authority. Unless you believe that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, you're not saved. It's about authority. It's about putting down your own authority and accepting that God has authority. So he's very serious about that. He's very much that you have to show honor to them, that you have to submit to them, whether it's a husband, a father, a priest, a king, that they have real authority and God cares about authority. But at the same time, he says in Isaiah, he's going to destroy the nation of Israel and then the nation of Judah because they won't defend the fatherless. They won't defend the weak. They won't defend the poor. They won't defend the widow. That they're allowing authorities to take advantage of these people. So God says, I'm going to pour out my wrath on you. And you look at during the Reformation, people like Samuel Rutherford, or slightly afterwards, Samuel Rutherford was looking and saying that the Christians actually have a duty to resist tyranny in government. So the question is that we're going to talk about tonight is, did the American Revolution get it right? Did it balance these things in a proper way?
And I think there's, a lot of aspects to that question. And, there were millions of people in the 13 colonies at the time. So, each of those people did a lot of them were loyalists. But, the question isn't, did every single patriot do things that were right? But the question is, you look at the totality of the process, because it was a long process. It wasn't just everybody got together on July 4th, 1776 and declared independence.
July 2nd, right?
Well, it wasn't.
Either way,
but it wasn't like a one-day thing. It was for years that they had been working through these issues. So the question is, by the time you get to the end of that, were they in the right, biblically speaking? Were they rebelling against a legitimate authority, or were they doing something that was biblical, something that was interposing against a legitimate tyrant? And it's it's useful to discuss because it is the origin of the country, and it's something that sets the country on its course. And there definitely were good aspects to it and bad aspects to it. But you at some point those people had to make the decision: which side am I going to be on? And it's useful to look back at that.
I do think it's important that, because you hear now when people debate it that a lot of people are on one side or the other. And I think it's important to recognize there are two sides. That I think a lot of people, quote, resistance to tyranny as obedience to God. And they turn around and they say, I'm being oppressed by these people, so I have the right to rebel against them. My taxes are too high, so I have the right to rebel against them. And then there's other people who go, you always have to submit to authority. There's never anything that authority can do that says you've reached a limit where you go, it's too far. And both of those positions have problems because the Bible actually holds you accountable to do things if people are being oppressed. And at the same time, it says that you have to honor authorities. If you take too simplistic of an answer, you get down to a very unbiblical position that becomes this absolute, where God's actually saying, you're supposed to reason through these things. You're supposed to consider these things. I have given you commands, and you need to figure out how to apply them in difficult situations.
And I think we, should realize that we're also Americans. We're heirs to the American Revolution. So we kind of, especially for conservatives, you kind of default to that. At least maybe not under the Trump era, but until recently, it's is there even a question that the Americans were right? But it is something that actually is a high standard to say that you're overthrowing the king. I mean, that shouldn't be something that we say, well, obviously that was good. He's a king after all. Kings are horrible. But it's biblically speaking, it leans the other way. The default should be to not do that.
And some of that you talked about resisting tyranny. Well, how do you, part of the problem or the challenge in figuring it out is, what is the tyranny? What are people saying is the tyranny? And is that really, biblically speaking, tyranny? Or is it just something we don't like? My taxes are too high.
Right.
I don't like that.
Taxation without representation. Well, through the history of the world, most people have had taxation without representation. That's actually a pretty bad argument. I consider that to be the weakest argument of the founders.
I think there were two things that you kind of said in the beginning that's really worth pulling out to emphasize as we go into this. And one is where people kind of say, why does it matter in this particular case? And the truth is even if you don't know much about history, the truth is what you think about things like that actually shape how you, like people have a knee-jerk reaction to how they think about authority. So you already have an opinion on how on the founding of America. You already have one in your mind, and you probably even use a general rule of thumb about there's times where you might use it to justify things that are unrighteous. And the other part is that, there's a popular saying, the devil's in the details. And what we're kind of emphasizing here is that actually righteousness is in the details as well. I mean, that in almost any situation, it really does come down to find facts about what you were doing, why you were doing it, what information you had, what the structure was. And people often just want to gloss over things and say nothing really matters. And the truth is God actually cares a great deal about process. So, as we look at this, those two things really, people should consider that.
And I think, where you have to start is in Romans, because the default position of man since the fall has been to say, God can't appoint people to tell us what to do. Right? That is rebellion. We don't want a civil magistrate over us. We don't want an elder in a church over us. We don't want a father over us. We don't want a husband over us. We don't want all these people, because in the end, God has appointed these authorities as a reflection of him. And because we're in rebellion to God, natural man is rebellion to all authorities. So whenever we consider authority, that's where we have to start with. We have to recognize that in our flesh, we are going to have a propensity to rebel against authority. So the place to recognize or to start is to go, what did God say about authority, which would be Romans 12. We're starting in Romans 12. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourself, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. You want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. And so the first thing to recognize is the default has to be to submit. The default has to be God has appointed this authority. We have to show honor to that authority. We have to submit to that authority. That's the default. You have to have really strong reasons to say we're not going to submit to that authority.
And there's a modern interpretation out there. People might object to it being called modern, but I think it is pretty modern. And that interpretation of this passage says that Paul wasn't saying, Romans, submit to the rulers who are over you. He was saying, well, rulers, you are God's ministers, so you need to be godly. And actually, people don't need to submit to anyone unless they think they're being perfectly godly, which is just not what the passage says. And it was...
He's writing to the church in Rome, which at the time the church in Rome was under an emperor that all of the emperors were pretty cruel, wicked people. Obviously, Nero's the worst in most ways, but they were all bad.
The other thing that I think often gets missed by this passage, by people on both sides, is that it actually talks about authorities, that you submit to authorities. And there is never a time where God has only appointed one single authority in any situation. Even with Nebuchadnezzar, who God put more power in any one man's hand on earth, I think, than any other king that's ruled on earth. There were people that he had even appointed, like Daniel had authority, and while he had that authority, even though Nebuchadnezzar could take it away at a whim, while he had that authority, he had great obligation to act. He had great obligation to use that authority in a right way. And it was up to God whether Nebuchadnezzar took that authority away from Daniel ultimately. And I think it's really easy for people to create these false dichotomies. And they, like I said, both sides will pretend like there's only one authority and you must submit to that authority and that authority alone. It's like, no, there's other authorities, and the church has authority and parents have authority, and there are real things that have to be considered. And I think it causes a lot of damage in churches. It causes a lot of damage in the nation. It just flattens things, and it makes it a really horrible image of what God has actually made. It's more complex.
Right. I mean, and that was the divine right of kings that was fought before that, where the idea was that if the king spoke, he was the only authority. He was the picture of God. If he spoke, that was it. Which you look at the Anglican system, where the king is the head of the church. That's coming from that Erastianism. That's coming from that idea, is that the king is really just a representative of God, and everybody else is just a pseudo authority, and the real authority is the king. And obviously that had been argued with and debated and fought over, and people died over that. And yet we forget those things, and we go back, and just like so much of the church spends so much time just going back and not really thinking through and considering battles that were fought before, and how they were won, and why people settled on the doctrinal positions that they did. It's not like these things were random. They were real battles that people really debated and really came to conclusions to. So the first thing to remember is they are the avenger of God's wrath. That's why he says he appoints them. And so, and that matters, because if instead of avenging God's wrath, if what they are doing is causing God's wrath upon a nation, that's kind of where you have to start, is if they're causing, if you're killing the innocent, God says his wrath is upon the nation. And so if your authority is causing his wrath rather than avenging his wrath, that's kind of a requirement even before you start thinking about whether it might be righteous in any way to overthrow him. Not just if you don't like what he's doing, not just if he costs you a lot of money, but if he's actually bringing God's wrath upon a society rather than removing it, because he's the avenger of God's wrath. That's what the civil magistrates are appointed for.
And there's a part of it where, we're not going to spend too much time in this episode on this idea, but if God appoints someone and he's doing things that seem horrible, you should recognize God may have greater wrath towards something else than what you care about.
Yes.
And you may need to go, God, what is it that you have wrath against that maybe I need to be part of repenting or pushing to repent again, so that God's wrath is turned away. Because I think a lot of times people don't actually believe that God has the power to remove that authority. They don't. They're using the whole thing as just a smokescreen to let them do what they want, and they just really don't have any faith. And if you actually have faith, you look at it and you go, God is fulfilling his wrath. What is it that he's angry about?
I think another thing to recognize too is that Romans 13 isn't the only passage about the government. There's a lot of other passages there's passages that say and they point towards what a more ideal government is. But that doesn't mean that you can just overthrow your government just because it's not ideal. But there are principles for that. And there's also principles of, that you have, that it's right to exercise your rights that you have in your form of government. Like Paul is a Roman citizen, and you see him saying, is it wrong to beat me, a Roman citizen and uncondemned? Or he's exercising those rights. Because the American Revolution, like I mentioned before, doesn't start with people saying, let's get rid of the king. It starts a long time before that, where people had no thought of saying, we want to be independent, no thought of getting rid of the king. Where they're saying, we have rights under our system of government, and they're not being respected. And so we're going to protest, we're going to take, action that they said was legal, that they believe was legal, to try to get redress for issues under their system of government.
It's important to recognize that, we see the same thing with Martin Luther, right? Part of honoring the king, or honoring the Pope, who he was looking at as kind of a pseudo-king, pseudo-high priest, and to say honor them, and you kind of start out by honoring them by saying, well, it's the people underneath you that are acting unrighteously, and if we just petitioned the ultimate authority, this is what Luther was saying, if the Pope just knew what was going on, he'd fix this. And of course he was wrong, but that is the attitude that you are to start with, is that, if we just petition the right people, if we made people understand what was going on, they would stop this and not just presume that they're evil. because I think a lot of times where people want to go is they're evil, that's why they do this. But you look at the people that God has really blessed, because God blessed America. It's really hard to say God didn't bless America after the American Revolution. But if you look at people who God blessed, like Luther or like the American Revolution, it starts with people going, no, if the king only knew, if the Pope only knew, these things would be fixed, because it starts with an attitude of honoring. And it actually starts with an attitude of doing good, which is what God says that's how you deal with it. That's the first thing that you deal with, is that you do good. You overcome evil with good. You don't go, we're going to rebel. Instead, you go, if he only knew, he would change, because we want to be a blessing to him. And working that out by trying to do, assuming the best, and trying to treat them as if they're actually good.
Yeah, it starts with an attitude of humility, and as you said, honoring. To say this is the authority that God has put over us, so we're going to assume the best and attempt to make those changes.
I mean, and there's this part of it where even if you think about it from a practical level, if I'm just a regular person and there's a king who's evil, the only way that I, by myself, could overthrow that king is if the king tried to kill me personally. You know what I mean? Like I would, he would have to, or try to kill my wife right before I could act to protect her. I don't have much authority from God to do, you know what I mean, to really fight directly against that king. Other than that, if his soldiers come and his soldiers try to kill me, I can resist his soldiers if they're trying to unjustly kill me in that same way. But just because I try to just because one of his soldiers does something wrong doesn't mean I can go kill the king now.
And it also doesn't mean that you go, the king is the one doing it.
Right.
Because the reality is now we have a lot better information, right? But if you think about it, it was 3 months, something like that, to go round trip to England. So the communication was incredibly slow. And so you don't even really know what the king's thinking, because it's passing through a whole bunch of hands, and then you get this result and you go, this result is unjust, but you don't know what the king's been told. You don't, right? I mean, there's this huge gap of knowledge that modern technology is closing. So now we hear from Donald Trump every day, but that wasn't true. Okay, 2 or 3 times a day.
Right.
But that
not us personally, just like the rest of you do.
Oh, he's calling.
You don't really have direct information from him. You have all these other layers that it's going to before it gets to you. And so the right presumption is he's doing the right thing, and that there's intermediate ministers that aren't doing the right things, and you give him the benefit of the doubt.
Which, in this case, and similar with Charles I and the English Revolution, they were all about saying the king, or the English Civil War, they were all about saying the king isn't really doing it, it's just his ministers. But the thing was, it wasn't true the whole time. It was the king all along, right. Both times. So it is kind of...
But you kind of have to wait until it's proven that it's the king. That's part of showing honor, is not to presume that it's the king, but you actually have to go through the process of proving it. And that's really where the argument that they start with the Declaration of Independence is, we've tried, and we've tried, and we've tried. Right? It says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. When a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation, all having a direct object, the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Now, you can argue about whether they're reading the situation right, but you can't argue that they were pretty long-suffering. They did this for over a decade, where they were trying to negotiate with the king and negotiate through his ministers and making appeals and petitions. And, again, you can argue that they came to the wrong conclusion, but you can't argue that they didn't show significant patience. So when you look at the American Revolution, a lot of the people were pretty much focused on money. And it's really easy to go back and paint the founders and not look at them as a group of prideful men that are upset about money. They're upset about unrighteous things. And they weren't all trying to fight tyranny. A lot of them were trying to fight for what they wanted. And we shouldn't go back and paint them with some rose-colored glass, or look at them with rose-colored glasses and say, oh no, these were these great men that were doing these great things. A lot of them, their motives weren't that great. And so we have to be careful. And I think one of the people that I think whose motives were pretty good was Patrick Henry, where he had actually thought it through, and he was trying to make arguments much more from a biblical framework than a lot of the other founding fathers.
But another thing too is they did have, quite on many instances, they were making decisions that were not based on money. Like some of the taxes, what they would do, like they had, a series of taxes on a lot of stuff, and the colonists' argument is saying, according to our charters, according to history, Parliament's not supposed to be taxing us. We have our own legislatures that are our parliaments that are under the king, and so we're supposed to be taxing ourselves. And so at times they would, the Parliament got rid of the taxes, except for it was just
very minor.
Yeah, very minor. Or so the Boston Tea Party, that was based on, it wasn't that they say we don't want to pay taxes on tea. It was actually the tea would have been cheaper if they had taken that tea, because there was a surplus of tea, and so they were giving them a deal, but they wanted to keep that pattern of them accepting taxes from Parliament. So it was cheaper tea, but it had a tax on it. And so when they're throwing it overboard, they're actually, costing. Well, they're not even buying tea because they have a boycott on. But that actually would be cheaper tea. But they're making a principled stand rather than a financial stand. And then they try to go above and beyond, where they're being strict at that incident and making sure no one's stealing tea. They break a lock and then they send a lock to replace it. So there are a lot of examples where they were being purposeful to be doing things based on principle rather than just financially motivated, though that certainly was a factor.
And a lot of what started was the financial motivation, and then as they saw the usurpation of rights, they became more concerned. And I think a lot of them were concerned because they figured sooner or later that they'd go back to tax. They're still trying to pay for the French and Indian War, and so they impose these taxes on them, and they assume that sooner or later they'll have to pay for that war. And so even if they dropped the taxes, I agree with you, they were making a principled stand, but we shouldn't think that money wasn't driving some of the stuff to that point.
Yeah, and the other thing too is there's it's not just the American Revolution. I mean, there's a long history of it going back to the English Civil War, going back to the Glorious Revolution, where that's a lot more religious, saying we don't want a Catholic king, we don't want Puritans to be oppressed. And then, kind of connected with that in the 1600s, you had, almost revolutionary events where they're saying our charter is being overthrown, our government in the colonies is being overthrown by the king. And so, I think at the time of the Glorious Revolution, there was a bloodless revolution in Massachusetts where they're throwing off the royal governor, saying, you're tyrannical, we don't, and it doesn't get a lot of press because thousands of people didn't die, but they do have this history of standing on principles. And so while in the American Revolution there are more financial reasons, it's not something that's coming out of nowhere.
And I think part of it is we should be clear that to do something that follows biblical principles doesn't require everybody doing it, or even a percentage
Right.
of them to be Christians. And so there was,
Or even to be intentionally following biblical. I mean,
Right.
if the biblical thought patterns are in a society, people can think in biblical ways even without recognizing that it's coming from the Bible.
right.
When the church is strong, when the church is teaching men to obey all things that God has commanded, then they tend to think in different ways, and that has a real impact on society.
And that's part of it is what you're as you're talking about some of these things, we should recognize that some of these men there were a large percentage of these men that were unbelievers, yet it's fairly impressive what they were willing to endure and the lengths that they would go through to follow certain practices even without having the Holy Spirit. And so we should look at this. It should be pretty awe-inspiring in a sense for people who don't believe that the church has any power in the world. There should be a real part of it where you should look at it and go, no, it does, because many of these men weren't saved, and yet you look at the way they acted.
And you look, and there is this other thing that's going on. You have the Enlightenment at the same time, and so you look at the Declaration of Independence. It's this mixed document that part of it is saying these are biblical reasons, and other parts are going because of the
humanism,
because of the value of the individual. We have the right to do this, and so the reasons are mixed.
And Thomas Paine is an interesting example of that because he's the young propagandist during the War for Independence, and in I think it's Common Sense. He says, we don't need a king in America. We just should have the Bible be our king. So it's like theonomy. He's a theonomic, revolutionary. But then after the American Revolution, he's one of the most famous atheists in the world. So a lot of what he was writing was, not as principled as much as what will get the job done. But you see, right, in one guy, you have those two strains. And then, kind of the American Revolution kicks off an era of a lot of revolutions. And those are, like in South America, they're a lot more Enlightenment driven. They don't have the background of Protestant Christianity, Reformed Christianity. And so those are all, most, if not all, are just disasters, and
especially the French Revolution.
Right, French Revolution as well. But you have, Simon Bolivar, who's the big South American revolutionary, and he helps a lot of countries revolt, spends years at war with the Spanish, and at the end of his career, he's like, you know what? I think this was all a mistake, because he recognized these Enlightenment principles have just caused destruction to all these countries, and that's what you get when you have the Enlightenment,
right?
View prevailing, and in many ways, in ways you could say the American Revolution hurt America. There's some, depending on, you can see some statistics where it wasn't an event that actually increased Christianity. You see like church attendance declining after the war compared to before the war. You hear accounts of people saying over this time of war, people are a lot more profane. They're going out, pursuing, worldly things, in, fighting and mixing up with getting a lot of bad influences. So they're saying this actually, for the cause of Christianity, is actually harmful. So, I don't think we should have a rosy picture of it's like this glorious Christian thing in every consequence. There were a lot of bad stuff, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't just because there were bad consequences.
And when you come to, like you're talking about, I think, not painting a rosy picture and being thoughtful and deliberate as you go forward. I think when you look at somebody like Patrick Henry, and I think this quote we'll read here in a second, that's exactly the argument that he's kind of making here, is that you should be thoughtful and deliberate. You should look at things. You shouldn't deceive yourself. So here's Patrick Henry. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have been pleased to comfort themselves and the House. Is it that insidious smile with which our petition has been lately received? Trust it not, sir. Suffer not yourself to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves, are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last argument to which kings resort. I ask, gentlemen, sir, has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. And what have we to oppose to them? Shall we try arguments? Sir, we have been trying that for the last 10 years. Sir, we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne, and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of Parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after these things, may we indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation? There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. And so, you can see here, Henry's going, look at what's outside. Look at the world. Look at what's been done. Look at 10 years of work. Because, I mean, you've probably seen this in real situations, whether it's in business, whether it's in a church. There are people who they are patient. They go through things, and the same thing begins to happen. And as they've worked through it, everything that happens, when it does reach the authorities, the response continues to be negative. The response, in fact, increases in its vehemence against them. But it's really easy for people to continue to cling to hope after those things, to go, well, I think if we just tried a little harder, I think if we just made our argument a little stronger, I'm sure they'll hear us this time. And he's going, look.
This isn't how people are.
Right. Now they've given us their answer. They've sent soldiers. Why do you think they've sent soldiers here if they're not for us? This is why Chamberlain is looked at as an incredibly foolish prime minister, right? As he goes to meet with Hitler, and Hitler gives some kind words, and he comes back and goes, we'll have peace in our time. And he was a fool. And so there is this part of it where, Henry is putting before them and going, you should think through this. You should look at what we've done, and you should come to a conclusion. You have to make a decision at a certain point.
And that's kind of the point, is that you really do need to make a decision. You could argue that it was the wrong point, but I do think there's a point where you go, there is real oppression that's happening, and we have a real duty towards our people to stop the oppression. And you can't just argue forever and allow the oppression to continue. And I don't think it's financial oppression. I don't think the financial oppression was, even as Joshua said, that the reason that they were attacking Boston or going into Boston had to do with pittance in terms of the money. That wasn't the issue. The issue was who had authority, and the issue is who could pass laws. The way it's typically taught in school now is that it was all about money, taxation without representation. It was this mixture of authority and money. And there is some of that goes on because natural man, money really appeals to him, right? And so it is a means to appeal to people. But at the same time, I think we need to be really careful. You can't justify a war based on that, right? James 4 says, what causes wars among you? You lust and you do not have. If you have wars based on money, you should go, these are probably unrighteous. And so when we hear all the time, taxation without representation, we should be pretty concerned about that, because that's not a just basis for war. But so, right after saying not to resist the authorities, it goes on in Romans 13, and Paul says, starting in verse 6, for because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Our taxes are at 50%. God says it's judgment when you're at 10%. So what should we do? We should pay our taxes. That doesn't give you the right to rebel. And we should just recognize, and with inflation, it's a lot higher percentage than that, and that still doesn't give you the right to rebel. God can provide for his people. You don't go, oh, it's money, because that's basically rejecting the idea that God can provide and will provide.
But in that instance, you're not saying we can't petition the government, complain, whatever. But
vote for better
we
leaders.
Can't just say,
vote for better leaders.
Right. We can't just say, well, I'm just paying 10%.
But even if you look at what should upset Christians more than a 50% tax rate is the fact that our government is the biggest user of false weights and measures in the world, basically, with the way that we print money without having anything behind it, and we're inflating our currency. So we should be upset by the injustice of that and the rebellion of God against that and the evil of that, rather than money itself and rather than our tax rate. So we should see things the way God sees it, which is, hey, I can provide for you. It doesn't really matter that much.
And most of us have been we've been provided for we're wealthier than most people have been in the history of the world, even with the rates that we pay.
And interestingly,
except that we owe so much money that we're not that wealthy, but it gets complicated.
No, and interestingly, if we did fight against them having false weights and measures, and it changed to God's way of doing it correctly, it would take care of the other thing.
Right.
And we wouldn't have, the taxes would go down.
Right.
Because God's ways are better.
Right. You paid as you went rather than just printing money. Our government would be a lot smaller.
So we're talking about high taxes, we're talking about these other things, and at the time they were complaining about the king abusing them, and what God says in 1 Samuel is, this is what you should expect. So 1 Samuel 8, verses 11 through 18. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands, and captains over 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. So God says very clearly, when Israel's saying, oh, we want a king, we want to be like everybody else, we want to have a king, he's saying, this is what you're going to get. Yeah.
This is what kings do. And so if that's the nature of kings, we shouldn't turn around and say that gives us the right to assassinate them. That gives us the right to overthrow them, because they're doing what God says is a picture of his judgment. And we should be really careful not to go, well, if you want a king, if you can't rule yourself and you want a king, guess what? This is what it will be like. And so that doesn't give you the ability to just say, therefore we'll overthrow the king.
Well, and you said, executing God's judgment. This isn't like God's not in control and he's saying, well, if you put someone else in charge, they're not going to be nice and this is what's going to happen. He's saying, this is what I will ordain to happen.
What was the Stamp Act? It was like 3% or something like that, or the T-tax was somewhere around 3% or something that was very nominal. And if the justification was for the war was taxation without representation, and now we have a 50% tax rate, and we have with the increase in the size of our country, we have less influence on the government than they did. And yet, and then we turn around and we go, oh, this is horrible. Well, guess what? That would say that we could revolt now, and I don't think we have the right to revolt now.
But in the Declaration of Independence, they were pointing to a lot more things than just saying, Parliament has usurped authority over us. Because a lot of it was the response. Because, they were... Well, a lot of it was the response. Because the King and Parliament tried to crack down on them and, began to, pervert justice in a lot more ways and more important ways. And so there's a lot of, it'd be useful for you to read the Declaration of Independence if you haven't recently. I mean, we have a few quotes here from it, but there's a lot more, and it's not super long, but it does a good job in laying out, what they were using as their justification for independence. A lot more than you would normally hear just on, the summaries you read in the history books.
And when I pulled out these quotes, I was pulling out the ones that I think are much more biblically justified, versus there's other ones that are much more Enlightenment justified, where they're making appeals to the nature of man, that he shouldn't have to have that, as opposed to there really is a duty to protect the weak.
And here's a few of them from the Declaration of Independence. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries, and he obviously being the king.
And so when you go back to the justification for why you are not to resist authorities, it is because they are to bring justice. So when you have a king that's intentionally making it so that you can't have justice, because the courts are the means to administer justice, right? That's what it says, for establishing judiciary power so that you can have administration of justice. So when the king's making it so that your society is unjust, that's contrary to why God says he appoints the higher authorities. But the first one is, yes, he would leave judicial vacancies or not create enough judgeships, even as the population of the colony was increasing, so that basic things that require a judge, like dealing with crime and stuff, they couldn't be dealt with because you didn't have judges that were appointed by the king, and the king had the right to appoint who was judges.
And for the second one, it's just, this thing that a lot of people don't think about, but the person who pays them, the person who, that those things really matter. That they recognize, if the colonies paid them, the judges would think differently. The judges would think the people were serving are the colonies, but in the end, they were serving the king and the king's interest. So he was attempting to pervert justice.
And it's why in our Constitution it says that you can't reduce the payment of the salary of a judge once he's appointed, because for that very reason, that's another way to control the judge. If you don't like what he does, you just reduce his salary. And so that way the government could do it. And the point was, they're saying this created injustice in the colonies, and we have to do something to reestablish justice. So when you look at the basic purpose of government that God appoints, it is to create a system of justice. And most tyrants even create a system of justice. Most tyrants stop murder. Most tyrants stop rape. They stop theft, not necessarily when they steal or they rape, but they do it when somebody else does it. And so when you look at it, they're going, you won't even let us deal with normal things that need to be dealt with in order to have a society that's a civil society that's survivable. So you see some injustice there. So where they're supposed to be the avenger of God's wrath, all of a sudden what he was doing is preventing justice. But there were worse things that he did, and one of the worst things that he did was impose martial law when there really wasn't any justification for martial law. And martial law then was a really serious thing because you quarter troops. But to read from the Declaration, he is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, recording large bodies of armed troops among us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. So this is where they're going, you're supposed to be the avenger of God's wrath, and instead what you're doing is you're actually oppressing the weak. You're oppressing the people and quartering large bodies of troops. When you say that the military is independent of and superior to the civil power, what that means is that the military can go in and you can quarter them in a person's home. They can take all their food. They can rape the women. And the military doesn't do anything about it, and the civil powers don't have any ability to punish them. And so basically you are very much subjecting the people to personal tyranny, not just some idea of tyranny, but you're putting soldiers in their home that make them slaves, that they have to do whatever the soldiers want them to do.
And you have laws with partiality, because you have different laws for different.
Right. The soldiers had completely different sets of controls, what they'd be punished for, completely different than what the rest of society would be. So this is where you see that they're looking at it and saying, look, you who were supposed to be the one that was producing justice, you have become the oppressor. You have become the one that's destroying people. You have become the one that's plundering. You have become the one that instead of stopping rape, you're the one that's setting up the situation so that our women get raped, so that the people get plundered. And you are the oppressor. So these are the statements in the Declaration where they're literally rebuking the oppressor, which is a very righteous thing to do, even if it's an authority over you.
And it's important kind of for the context of this. So the Declaration is in July 1776, and the war really breaks out in April 1775. So over a year earlier, that's Lexington and Concord. And that's where the British send out an expedition to go and seize Patriot munitions, which is why is the Second Amendment so high up in the amendments? Well, they had just fought a war saying that the militia has a right and had a traditional right throughout English history. You can even tie that back to the scriptures, but they had a right to have weapons to defend themselves. And so the British were sending out forces to steal the colonist weapons. And so that's where the war breaks out, is over those things. But then it's over a year later, after there's active conflict, after there's a siege of Boston and Battle of Bunker Hill, Battle of Dorchester Heights, the war is full on before they're even declaring independence. All that time they were still saying, we're fine submitting to the king. I mean, we have grievances we need addressed, but we're not saying we're rebels, get rid of the king, we want to make our own government. I mean, that's how long-suffering they were, is that it took a year of war, full-on war, before they actually said, this is unresolvable, and we need to just say that we're done.
Right. When Patrick Henry made that speech, that was April of 75. That was at the same time, roughly, as Bunker Hill or as Lexington and Concord. And so he's going, no, we've reached the point. But that was just kind of the start that caused people to think about it. And it took them a year before they finally went, yeah, this isn't going to work, because they are literally attacking their own people.
Right. We didn't, I don't know if it'll be published, but we recorded an episode recently about women in the military, and we were just kind of talking about military in general, but a lot of people have this fantasy idea of what soldiers are like. And I mean, this is still true today, but especially throughout history, is soldiers and military were designed to take, undesirable elements out of culture. Young men who had violent tendencies, who were going to cause difficulty, bring them into this place where they could sort of be controlled and aimed at other people to unleash their aggression or their frustrations. And that's what was being quartered in citizens' houses. And so, I mean, you have, people who would have been criminals but for the fact that
they were removed out of England to protect English society, and then they were courting them into the people's homes in the colonies.
And just like where a police officer has this gradual progression of how you escalate things, soldiers pretty much have one level of escalation. It's, I'm either shooting you or I'm not shooting you. And if you cause me a problem, well, I have a gun. I'm actually allowed to carry a gun, and you may not be allowed to carry a gun. And I'm going, if I think you're threatening me, you're not doing something with me, I'm going to shoot you, and then I'm going to say that you caused a problem. And so, I mean,
and then you'll be heard by a military tribunal and not by the civil courts, because you're under martial law, so the civil courts aren't working.
The next section here are very related. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So here, it's not only is he sending English troops to subdue the colonies and to conform them to his will, he's also bringing in, the German Hessians. And even worse, he's bringing in, the Indians to scalp all ages, sexes, and conditions. But I would point out here that there definitely is things in the Declaration of Independence that are exaggerations and propaganda. What went on in the American Revolution was not scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages. I mean, that is just not true. I mean, bad things went on, but that didn't happen. So that's true.
So I was reading a book about World War I, or listening to a book about World War I, and the stuff that happened, like in the Middle East during World War I, by England, was far worse than anything they ever did in the colonies. It's like on a whole different scale. And so we should, like you said, just recognize that the things that they're writing, I'm sorry, this isn't true. This is unfortunately very typical of quote unquote civilized nations.
But when you think about them happening to innocent people, these were horrible things, right? I mean, and so
I'm talking about what they did was to innocent people.
No, I'm not saying. What I mean is just from their, if you're thinking about it like in the sense of, we shouldn't have any problem with these. This would be like your local police force just coming in and raping people and killing people, and you go, for what reason? I mean, there was no justification for these things. So it's not like they're being outraged because they went to the store and there was no milk and they're calling it
right.
I mean, it's horrible things.
And they're saying that it's very wrong that we're British citizens and you're treating us as British citizens like we're not.
Right. As if we're your enemies.
Right. And they're actually paying savages to be savage.
Right.
And one thing that's interesting is that, it's very possible that if Britain had been harsher on the Patriots in the years leading up to 1775, that they may have been able to crush the revolution pretty effectively, because they were, they were giving them a lot of grace in certain ways. I mean, they were like quartering troops, but then they weren't, like, Boston was not allowed to have town meetings. But the government was fine with them just adjourning the meeting they have and then, have another session of the same meeting, because that's technically not a new meeting. So they let them do things like all kinds of stuff like that, and we're trying to be reasonable, and providentially that let the patriot cause gain a lot of strength. But it wasn't like they were, all the English had decided to become horrible tyrants and not have any of the understanding of rights that the Americans were appealing to.
But these things we should recognize this is not like something that's unusual. This is a normal pattern that happens in the world, that somebody wants to lord it over somebody else. At first they try to woo you, and then they exercise, right? I mean, this is just like a normal process of how God causes things to escalate to the point where there's actual, disintegration of whatever it was. I mean, it's a very common thing. It happens in churches all the time, that at first there's all this accommodation, but then people go, well, that's not a sufficient accommodation, and then So what happens here, we shouldn't just look at it and think of it as weird. We should go, this happens all the time in human society. The point of a king is to enforce laws, right? It's to bring justice. And one of the things that the king did is basically say, yes, the people who came before me gave you charters and set up laws, but I don't need to be bound by those. I can tear those up. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing there an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and a fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters and abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. So he came in there and he actually is saying, okay, I am the law. Yes, people entered into covenant before. Yes, this was a charter that was granted, but I can arbitrarily change it whenever I want. And the point of a righteous authority is that they keep law. They are not lawless. And so George III became lawless.
He was Rex Lex instead of Lex Rex.
Right.
I know, he wasn't saying necessarily divine right of kings, but he's basically saying, I'm the king so I can do what I want, which means, as opposed to
he's right, I've got soldiers.
Right. Instead of being the appointed leader of a government that has agreed to these laws before, so I need to be bound by them. And if I change them, I need to go through a particular process for it.
And it's worth noting here, because people do this over and over and over and over again, that the governments say the same thing. They go, well, if we just put troops in there and we just punish the people, then they'll turn towards us. If we just bomb Iraq, all of a sudden when we go in there, all the people will swarm to us. If we take the Taliban out of Afghanistan, the people will come to us and follow us. That never happens. Governments say that all the time, and it never happens. Because the reality is, you start bombing people's homes, or you start sending soldiers in to shoot people, and you start taking advantage of people and destroying things, they get mad. You firebomb Germany, it doesn't shorten the war, it lengthens the war. This is reality, and people need to recognize that. And this is just such a common lie that over and over again people say this. In our government, in my lifetime, the government has said this a bunch of times, and every single time the immediate response should be, not a chance. That is not how things work.
The key is to ally with somebody worse, a lot worse than you, like the Soviets. That way they will welcome you because they want you to take them over, not the Soviets.
Okay. Fair enough.
So there is a ploy. There's a way to do it. I mean, it is true that, like, when the early colonies were founded, the understanding was you get a charter from the king, and that is at the king's pleasure. And as soon as the king doesn't want you to have a charter anymore, your charter is gone. Which is something that they argued about for the next, 200 years or 150 years, and they went back and forth on it. But it wasn't, the king's position wasn't also he wasn't just making it up. It was something that kings had said for a long time, is that, we issue the charter, we take away the charter, we're the king, we do what we want.
But there was a civil war and stuff in between there that changed things, and the English side, that the people in America thought it should change things in the colonies as well.
And there's God's law that says your yes should be yes and your no should be no. And so, I mean, there is this part of it where there should be an expectation that what someone says that they hold to it.
Of course, if you say, here's what I'm going to do as long as I want to do it, it's a little different. But
that is true.
But, we're Americans. We can agree. It's just tyrannical, horrible.
Well, that really does come to the real question of, did they actually receive authority from God, where they were actually civil magistrates, or were they just acting as agents of the king? Because if they're just acting as agents of the king and he takes away the charter, they should just, the civil magistrates in the colonies, they should just submit to the king. And that's what the House of Parliament should do in the colonies, the various colonies. But yet they didn't see it that way. They saw themselves as having actual authority and not just acting as agents of the king. And the king saw them as just as his agents, so he could just retract their agency whenever he wanted to.
This is where it gets trickier, because a lot of the colonies, if not all of them, had charters that predated the king. That dynasty of English kings, because there had been a revolution. And the Glorious Revolution, where they replaced them with a new ruling family, and so the charters predated the king. So that kind of throws a wrench in the plans.
Predated the king in terms of his family, even not just predated like chronologically, but it was a different house that was now ruling England.
Right, and the idea of having elected representatives is a biblical idea, where they would appoint elders, and the elders predated, the Israelite kings. They predated even the Exodus, where they had recognized elders that are, rulers by, we don't know exactly if there was a system to appoint them, but, they were recognized representatives of the people. And so I think there's kind of when you have someone elected, even if the king said you're a magistrate because I gave you authority, doesn't mean that that's true. And it doesn't mean that he gets to decide that, because the way God ordered the world is that you have magistrates. Especially if they were elected, they are magistrates, not at the whim of whoever comes along who has armies.
So then that becomes the question. He basically disbands the legislators and says, you have no authority. And so, that becomes, were they legally appointed authorities or not? Because if they're legally appointed and you have a king that's tyrannizing the people, that are actually that are actually oppressing the people, then if you're actually a civil magistrate and not just, right, there's a difference between a police officer and a legislator and the executive branch. If you're actually have a civil magistrate and you're not a servant of the civil magistrate, you have to answer to God for how you use that authority. Or an elder at a church, right? There's a lot of churches that have a senior pastor and then an elder. The elder can't go before God and say, well, the senior pastor told me. God will go, you have to give an account for the souls, not him. And so if you're actually a civil magistrate and you actually have your authority, even though it was through an appointment system from the civil magistrate, it's still real authority that you really have a duty to exercise, and you really have responsibility to stop oppression and to protect the weak. That's why God gave authority to be the avengers of his wrath. And if the king's the one that's doing things that require a vengeance of wrath, then you should avenge the wrath.
So another section from their complaints. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. And so a lot of these are kind of, under the charter, they had legislators and houses just very much like in England, And the king had similar, the king can dissolve parliament in England and can do things like that. And so he was doing that and doing so repeatedly, so as soon as the new one would be appointed, he would dissolve that one. And then they had to re-elect new people, and he would dissolve them, or he would call meetings of them and say the meetings, they're in Boston, and he would call the meeting very far away from Boston so that they would have to travel there to meet there. And so there's this part of it where, the king is acting as if the charters are real in one sense, because he's acting as if I'm operating under this authority that I have through the charters and using it, and at the same time then pretending like I don't really have to follow the charter. And that actually lends credence to their argument that there is a real system of authority, and that they really are elected, that they have elected authority, and that they have the right to do these things. And so, but you can see how incredibly difficult it would be to live with someone consistently doing these types of activities. And
there's points where there's declared in rebellion and that their governments are all dissolved. And there's a point where they're saying, we need governments. You can't just get rid of all the government. That's, and you don't have troops over here to enforce a government. And so you're just leaving us to complete anarchy. There's no way that that's just. And so you say we're dissolved, but we need a government.
And they would go, okay, so we're going to do these laws, and they're going to send them back to England, and then the ship comes back after 3 months, and he didn't act on the laws at all. So he was really creating a lawless society, and so that would be not what pleases God. The worst form of government is anarchy, and that's basically what he was enforcing in the colonies. It is important to recognize that the Magna Carta, right, was kind of the first one that clarified the responsibilities or the rights of the King of England. And that was really with nobility. But the issue there was the only people that could raise taxes was the Parliament. The king couldn't do it without the Parliament. So he could dissolve the Parliament, but he couldn't raise taxes. All he could do is continue to collect existing taxes. And so when he dissolves the Parliament here, and then he goes and raises taxes through the Parliament in England, this is why it's a big deal, because this is now you're talking about 700-year-old law that he's rejecting, because they're British citizens. They have the right to representation when any taxes are raised. And so this is overthrowing something that's fundamental to the English system and had been for hundreds of years.
And another core principle when you're talking about their representative bodies being dissolved is that, is what's called the Doctrine of Interposition, where this is something that comes kind of the era after the Reformation, or the later parts of the Reformation. And it's where you have the idea derived from Scripture is that people should not be rebelling against the government. Even Paul's being persecuted, he doesn't say, I'm starting a rebellion. You can't do this to me. You're
says, I
evil.
appeal to Caesar.
Yeah, but so the idea is that there are examples in Scripture where people do stand against evil tyrannical rulers. You have Jehoiada leading in a rebellion against Athaliah and overthrowing her as queen and executing her. And we'll read another example in a moment. But so that is a biblical concept. But what's the difference between that and why didn't Paul do that? Well, one difference is that Jehoiada did have a position where he was a representative of the people as high priest. He had God-given authority, and so what the Doctrine of Interposition says is it's the lesser magistrate's responsibility to stand up against the greater magistrate, because they are an authority that has been appointed by God. It's not just you not liking something and then saying, I'm going to go try to kill the king. It is a God-given authority saying, I need to protect the people under me by resisting the tyranny of the authority over me.
And so so they're saying we have real authority from God. And as that real authority, when the king dissolves the Parliament, we're just going to move down the street. We're going to move to St. John's Church in Richmond, right? And we're going to meet there, which is where Patrick Henry made his speech, because that's where we're going to meet. Because fine, we're dissolved. Who cares? The king doesn't have the right to take away authority that was given to us by God, and we have the responsibility to interpose to stop the greater magistrate from abusing the people. Because the point of a magistrate is to constrain evil. It is to be the avenger of God's wrath. And it doesn't. And there's no biblical concept that says the king can do whatever evil he wants and the people are not allowed to do anything.
But that's just a case of somebody else exercising the authority that is within their bounds to exercise, as opposed to just rebelling because we don't like something.
Right. Trying to take over England would be one thing, but to try to say, no, in Virginia we're going to have laws, that's a very different thing.
If you ever go into any business, there's times where somebody makes a decision and your manager tells you, don't do this, I'll take care of it, and I'm going to talk to them. And anybody who's ever been in authority has had somebody who did that, and you recognize that that's why you appointed that guy in the middle. That he was literally appointed to make decisions like that. And if you want to get mad, you need to get mad at him and deal with him and talk to him. And so there's this part of it where, it's just a fundamental recognition of how authority works. And so, and I think it's just, this is what we were talking about earlier, what I was trying to talk about, where Scripture says you should submit yourself to the authorities, because frequently one of the ways that God replaces existing authorities is he raises up other authorities and moves them between you and that other authority, and that's how he deals with it. Is he causes someone to be in a position to interpose themselves. And sometimes that can cause nations to split. Sometimes it can just be, it can cause, the implementation of it can happen in lots of different ways. But functionally, that's almost always, he doesn't just tell you, you ignore an authority that's real, is he works through authorities to cause that other authority to be changed.
And, it's rare that God allows a people to become totally lawless and that everybody does what's right in their own eyes, where everybody becomes their own authority and there is no authority to say this is right and this is wrong. And when God does that, it's always judgment. And then what he does is he puts an authority over them, right? That's the book of Judges, is that everybody was doing what's right in their own eyes, so we'll make the Moabites over you. Everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. We'll put the Ammonites over you. This was the pattern of the book of Judges. And then God would raise up somebody who he appointed and he gave authority to. And sometimes, like in the case of Ehud, he even murdered him, right? It was cold-blooded murder, but yet God is looking at it and saying, I'm going to bless them through this man that I appointed and I gave authority to kill a tyrant.
And when you say cold-blooded murder, you mean we would look at it and we would say it's murder, but it wasn't like murder against
the Ten
Commandments.
Right. It wasn't that God was judging him because he did what God told him to do. And we look at it and there are people who go, you can never resist authority. You can never overthrow authority. But there's cases in the Scripture where that's just not true. There is, like Judges 3:15-22. But when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. By him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud made himself a dagger. It was double-edged and a cubit in length, and fastened it under his clothes on his right thigh. So he brought the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when he had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the stone images that were in Gilgal, and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. He said, keep silence. And all who attended him went out from him. So Ehud came to him. Now he was sitting upstairs in his cool private chamber. Then Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. So he arose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand and took the dagger from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. Even the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the dagger out of his belly, and his entrails came out. It's a very vivid picture, and God is going, I can raise up people and give people authority where if somebody's a tyrant, that I can have them assassinated, essentially, and that can be righteous because they really have authority from God. And so if they're not acting as agents of the king and they really have authority from God, there is a time where you can fight against the greater magistrate. And to say you can't is simply, there's plenty of patterns in Scripture that show that it's righteous to do so. Some years ago, we were studying through the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah is really the first book that God goes, I've had enough with you. He does it with history, the historical narratives. But in Isaiah, he has the prophets come and basically say, I'm going to destroy you. You're going to stop being my people. And that goes back to Deuteronomy 32, that Moses taught them that this is what's going to happen. But in Isaiah, God sends Isaiah and tells Isaiah, basically, here's why. They don't care about the weak. They don't care about the fatherless. They don't care about the widows. And since you don't do that, I will destroy you as a nation. So it's easy for us to look at the one side in Romans 13 and say, submit to all authorities. But we also have to look at the other side and go, God also says, I will judge not just the authorities, but I will judge the people when they allow people to be oppressed.
And God talks about this in Psalm 82 when he's talking about how he judges among the leaders and the people. And it's so Psalm 82, starting in verse 1, a psalm of Asaph. God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Free them from the hand of the wicked. So he's saying there the people have a duty to stand up for the afflicted, to stand up and fight the oppressor when people are being oppressed.
And specifically that the leaders do, right? When it says he judges among the gods, that's not singular. And that's talking about human rulers. That's not talking about
Idols.
It's not talking about idols. It's talking about human rulers that have real responsibility, real authority, real might, real power in the world. And he says, I'm going to judge among the gods. I'm going to judge King George III, and I'm also going to judge the Parliament and the House of Burgesses in Virginia. I'm also going to judge the civil magistrate and the judges that are in Massachusetts. I'm going to judge all these people. I will judge among the gods. And so we can't just go and say, well, the king told me to do it, so that's what I'm going to do, because God says, that's not how I judge. Are you actually caring for the weak? Are you actually caring for the poor? Are you actually rebuking the oppressor?
I mean, when you just said the king told me to do it, it just made me think of another, we were talking a lot about authority here. If you're a soldier and your commanding officer tells you to go in and kill all these innocent civilians, you have a duty to not do that.
This has been embedded in our law since the Revolution, right. Is that when people join the military, they have to take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Right. So if somebody tells them and gives them an unlawful order, they even have the responsibility to act as a civil magistrate and go, no, I won't do that. And so we need to recognize that they were thinking along those lines, even when they write things like the Constitution, they set up our initial laws, they're actually thinking, no, these things matter. Who has authority matters. And nobody has the right to be over the Constitution. So if anybody gives you a command that's contrary to the Constitution, as somebody that's part of government, whether it's military or whether it's civil, you have the responsibility to say, no, I won't do it. This is the higher authority.
As you were saying about Isaiah, I mean, like what God was judging them, and then you actually see what God says, what he desires people to do, which you see in Isaiah 58, 6-8. Is this not the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh. Then your light shall break forth like the morning, your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. And so there's a part of it where God is, you look at the detail level where he's condemning it. When you say we need to create some institution to go and take care of the poor, he's saying, no, I want you to take care of the poor who are cast out. I want you to bring them into your house. He's saying when you see the naked, that you think of it as, this is my own flesh. I can't, it's wrong for me to distance myself from that. And so when you think about oppression, you shouldn't just think of we need to create institutions that don't have oppression. We need to separate ourselves from the institutions, and we need to become those who provide for the poor and and care for those who are oppressed.
Sometimes my kids ask me, like, who's the worst president? Who's the worst king of England? And I think but I think a ruler who goes to war with his own people, that's really, really high mark against you. It's one thing to put down a truly wicked rebellion, but when you're at war with your own people, you're in grave risk of being an oppressor, because you have many people dying because of your choices.
And when you're intentionally starving them, God says, share your bread with the hungry. And because in almost all those cases, there's an intentional movement to try to, you block the port so stuff can't come in. You do all these things to actually try to impose starvation on your people. And God says, this is not what the righteous do. This is how I judge nations. I judge nations for doing this. And when you're doing it to your own people, it's one thing to besiege an enemy because they've done something that is just for you to go to war against them, or even if it's unjust, that's still better than you attacking your own people when you are supposed to be the one that's supposing to help them, and instead you're the one that's destroying them. One of the reasons that I wanted to read this quote was that it does say, then your light shall break forth like the morning, and your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. We do need to look and say, one of the ways that you do judge is the consequences that God does, and the consequences afterwards. I mean, there were a lot of Anglicans that stopped going to church, and I'm not even saying the church got that healthy, but a lot of people moved to the United States. The United States became very powerful over the few decades afterwards. It resisted Arminianism, which was spreading through England and the continent. It resisted it for a long time. And so the church was healthier than it was in other places in the world. And one of the things that you have to say is God blessed America after the American Revolution. So we are supposed to look and say, what is God doing? And there are real blessings that are measurable blessings that you can see after the American Revolution. And it, in so many ways, transformed the world, because we're the ones that changed the idea that you have a written constitution, you make an oath to the written constitution. Well, that's the prevailing view in the world now. They frequently ignore it. They frequently break it, just like we frequently break it and we frequently ignore it. But even that idea that it's not just one man, that everything is encapsulated in that one man and he sits there and he has all the power. Ever since the American Revolution, the world has been moving towards more and more that it's not that way. People talk about what a terrible tyrant Putin is. He still has elections. Yeah, they might be fraudulent in many ways, but there's still a constitution. There's still the idea that there is a law higher than a man. And that very much spread through the world from the American Revolution. So to say that this was evil, then you have to also look at the fruits.
And I think, too, when you're looking, was the American Revolution biblical? With so many historical questions like that, you, in a way, you can't answer that question. You can answer, what specific people did at specific times. Did they do the right thing or did they do the wrong thing? If by the American Revolution you meant, the radicals who were threatening to tar and feather anyone who, tried to collect the king's taxes, no, that's not right. You can't go and, coerce people with violence to get them to not do what the king told them to do. That's not right. If you're talking about people who said, well, the king put the tax on us that we believe is, illegal, so we're simply not going to buy those products anymore and peacefully just say, we're just going to do without. Well, that's a lot more reasonable. That seems like a way to exercise your right of saying, do I want to buy this or not? I'll just say, I have the right to decide what I'm going to buy. I don't think this is a right law, so I'll just not participate in it. That's understandable. If this all ramped up in 1 month, that would be very hasty and pretty wrong. But it took 10 years. So, in a lot of the famous founding fathers were not even on board at the beginning of those 10 years. But by the end, they look at how the king responded. They look at the way he, tyrannizes the people in response to their patient, at least writ broadly, patient protest. And it's hard to really get away from the fact that people did have a just cause for what they were doing. And they were trying to follow principles of acting from principle and not from pragmatism. They're trying to follow principles of doing things patiently, doing things humbly, and doing things through legitimate magistrates, and not just turning towards violence just because they're upset at what their magistrate is doing.
I do think we need to to recognize that a lot of the arguments that are frequently made, they are pragmatic and they don't reflect why I would argue that it was righteous, the revolution. For instance, even the idea of Parliament not having rights over America. Well, in the French and Indian War, Benjamin Franklin wrote something that the colonies signed on to at the Albany meeting, where they sent it over. They're asking for Parliament to pass laws over them. So that's very pragmatic. That then 12 years later or whatever it is, 11 years later, they go, there's no right for Parliament. And so we have to make sure that we look beyond just their emotional arguments, their pragmatic arguments, their arguments that they're convincing people of, and go, what were they really trying to do? Were they really trying to stop the oppression of the poor? Were they really trying to stop evil in the sight of God, because King George was no longer stopping evil, and they still had a responsibility for evil to be stopped? Making anarchy in the colonies was a really evil thing.
And if your standard becomes, like you were talking about, if your standard is that every single thing had to be completely righteous, well, then you'd pretty much have to do away with the monarchy as well. You know what I mean? It's like sometimes people create these ridiculous
false dichotomy.
Yeah, and so I mean, it just, the answer is you really do have to examine things, but you have to examine them in the same way. Otherwise it just becomes whoever was there first is righteous, and there is some validity to being established by God. I mean, to being established, but that's not the totality of validity, is because otherwise it just becomes whoever was there, you have to let them kill you if they want to kill you.
But I think you do have the principle that I think, some people these days are losing with Republicans in power. But the idea that, Christians are called to have their allegiance first to God and to the truth. And so they're not called to be team players for whatever side is closest to what they think is right. Which doesn't mean that they have to stand on the sidelines. It doesn't mean that they can't get involved. But, we have a responsibility to call out the people who are allies with us in certain ways when they are doing things that are wrong. And we can't just, cover stuff up just because we agree with them on certain issues and say, therefore, we'll just, ignore the rest. No, our first allegiance is to God and the truth.
Right. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. That's our responsibility. And their argument that was legitimate about why they had to overthrow King George III was because he was no longer doing justly. And if he's no longer doing the fundamental role of a king, there is a point where you go, just like Ehud did, where you go, God has appointed to me. And now Ehud had direct revelation. I'm not saying it's the same. But God does raise up people to say, we're going to break this tyranny.
Well, I mean, here's just a fun fact. I mean, George III was one of the most pious, by, plenty of reasonable standard, one of the most pious kings of England for many years, which kind of throws a wrench in how people might look at him. He also went insane and thought he was a cow. So
that's kind of a downside.
Holy cow.
Whenever the church looks back at history, we should look and examine the details, because as was said earlier, righteousness is in the details too. You actually have to look at the details of what happened and was this righteous? Were people making decisions that brought glory to God? Or were they just doing things that worked out? Because it's not just working out, are they doing things that match up with what God says is just? As we've discussed, we think the American Revolution was, but there's also debatable issues, and we should recognize and think about them. The church needs to do a better job about thinking about issues rather than just having knee-jerk reactions. Just to say, the American Revolution was right because we're American citizens. That's wrong. We're actually supposed to judge what went before and say, is what we have a product of what was good and right and holy and just? Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.